I wasn't supposed to end up here. 2 months ago, I was still pulling double shifts at the loading docks down in Brookfield, fighting off the winter chill with cheap coffee and the occasional cigarette break. Then the layoffs came, and the coffee didn't help anymore. My savings weren't exactly designed for long-term unemployment, and my rent had a way of reminding me that the clock was ticking. So, when I saw the job listing tacked to the corkboard at the diner, a faded printout, smudged from fingerprints and thumbtacks, I didn't even think twice. Night watchman needed mountain property, housing provided immediate start. The pay wasn't great, but it came with a roof over my head and heat included, which felt like more than I could ask for in January. I didn't notice the other line at the bottom until I'd already torn off one of the tabs with the phone number. In smaller text, someone had written, "Must follow security protocols without exception." It sounded more like a formality than anything else. The man who answered my call introduced himself as Mr. Keene, a clipped, older voice, professional but impatient. He didn't ask for a resume. He didn't ask for references. He just asked one thing: "How soon can you get here?" I left the next morning. The road to the resort wound up through the mountains like a snake, narrow and slick with patches of ice that glinted under the pale sun. My old sedan wheezed with every incline. The higher I climbed, the quieter it got. Cell service dropped somewhere around the last gas station, and the occasional pine tree became an unbroken forest pressing against both sides of the road. Snow had fallen here days ago, judging by the crusted edges along the shoulder, but no tire tracks marred the powder in front of me. It was as though no one had been up here since. When the resort finally came into view, it loomed above the tree line, a massive, weathered building with steep gables and dark windows staring down at the road like hollow eyes. Even from a distance, it looked empty in a way that wasn't just about abandonment. There was a stillness to it, not peaceful, not dead, more like it was holding its breath. By the time I pulled into the cracked parking lot, the light had already begun to dim. Mr. Keene was waiting for me at the front steps. He was shorter than I expected, wearing a heavy wool coat and a fur-lined hat that shaded his eyes. His breath puffed in small, controlled clouds as he shook my hand firmly. His skin was cold, and his grip was stronger than his thin frame suggested. "You made good time," he said, glancing at the empty lot behind me. "Not many people take this road in winter." Inside, the air was stale and faintly musty, like old furniture and wood left too long in the cold. The lobby was cavernous, with high vaulted ceilings and a chandelier that hung unlit above us, draped in cobwebs. Faded rugs covered the warped floorboards, and the smell of old wood and dust clung to everything. Mr. Keene led me to the reception desk, which still held a bell, a cracked leather guestbook, and a rotary phone. From behind the counter, he pulled out a long, weathered envelope sealed with a strip of red wax. "This," he said, handing it to me with an unusual gravity, "is your rule sheet. These rules are not suggestions. They are not negotiable. They are the only reason this building is still standing." I laughed lightly, thinking it was some elaborate joke, but his expression didn't change. "You will read them," he continued, "and you will follow them exactly as written. If you cannot, you will leave before sundown. Do you understand?" I nodded, suddenly uncomfortable under his steady gaze. The tour was quick. The first floor held the lobby, a small lounge with cracked leather chairs, and the kitchen, unused but still faintly smelling of grease and old coffee. Upstairs, long carpeted hallways branched off into dozens of locked guest rooms, all identical doors with tarnished brass numbers. He didn't take me higher than the second floor, though the building had 6. "The upper floors are closed," he said simply. "No reason for you to go there." We finished in a cramped office just off the lobby. The desk was pushed against the wall beside a window that looked out onto the empty courtyard. A narrow cot sat in the corner, covered in a folded wool blanket. "This will be your station," Keene said. "You make your patrols, keep an eye on things, and stay warm. I'll check in twice a week." He put on his gloves, gave me a final nod, and left through the front doors without another word. The sound of his boots on the front steps faded quickly, leaving only the creak of the old building settling in the cold. I sat at the desk for a long time before I finally opened the envelope. The paper inside was thick, yellowed at the edges, with neat typewritten lines. "Rules for night security, Mountain View Resort Patrol. Every floor once per hour. Do not look out the windows after midnight. If you hear the elevator moving, take the stairs. If you see lights in room 612, Call the caretaker immediately, at 3:17 a.m. Sit in the lobby and do not move until the grandfather clock chimes 3 times. Never speak to anyone you see inside after 2 a.m. I read them twice, my eyes snagging on the oddly precise times and numbers. 3:17 a.m. was an especially strange choice. I could almost understand the rest as safety guidelines. Old elevators could be dangerous. Peeking outside at night might expose you to intruders, but there was something in the phrasing that made them feel like more than just practical precautions. Someone had underlined, "Never" on the last rule. The ink darker and fresher than the rest of the type. The night fell fast in the mountains. By the time I made my first patrol, the hallways were dim except for a few wall sconces flickering with weak yellow light. My footsteps echoed down the corridors, the sound muffled by threadbare carpet. I checked the locks on the guest room doors, all secure. The stairwells smelled faintly of rust and old stone. The kitchen's walk-in freezer door was chained, shut from the outside, though the cold in there seemed to seep out into the room anyway. Nothing unusual, just a dead, empty building. Still, I kept glancing at the rule sheet on the desk whenever I returned to the office, as though the words might shift when I wasn't looking. By midnight, the place felt heavier somehow. The air seemed thicker, and the shadows at the end of the hallways seemed to stretch longer. I avoided the windows without thinking, catching my reflection in the dark glass only once before turning away quickly. When the clock in the lobby struck 1, I started my next patrol, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something. Deep in the silence, a faint metallic ding, echoing from somewhere above. This one was easy to dismiss, in theory. After all, I was the only person here. But the way it was written, "Anyone you see inside," suggested the possibility that there might be someone else. Not any intruder or any trespasser, just anyone. I read them again, slower this time. The paper smelled faintly of dust, and something metallic, like old keys. As I read, the sense of being observed crept in at the edges of my thoughts. Not the kind of watchfulness that comes from a visible person in the room, but something that moved in layers, as though the walls themselves were aware of me. The first hour passed quietly enough. I made my rounds with a flashlight in hand, the beam cutting narrow paths through the darkened hallways. Each door I passed had a brass number plate dulled by age. Some were scuffed around the handles, as if they'd been yanked open in a hurry. Others had thick dust along the floor, undisturbed for years. The second floor smelled faintly of mildew. One found a few empty linen carts abandoned in the hallway, and once I thought I heard a faint creak from one of the closed rooms. I told myself it was the wood settling in the cold. Back in the office, I checked the clock again. Jam 11:47 p.m. I was approaching the first window rule threshold. I'd promised myself I wouldn't test it, but every time I glanced up, my eyes wanted to wander toward the nearest pane of glass. It wasn't curiosity about what was outside. It was the irrational fear that something might already be there. By the time midnight struck, the quiet had deepened into something heavier. The heating pipes groaned in the walls, the kind of sound that could be mistaken for footsteps if you weren't paying attention. I caught myself staring at the nearest window anyway, but my own reflection in the black glass stopped me. For a moment, it didn't quite look like me. I turned away. At 12:37 a.m., halfway through another patrol, I stopped in the stairwell between the first and second floors. I thought I heard a metallic sound in the distance, not loud, but distinct. A ding, faint, muffled, but unmistakably mechanical. I froze, remembering the third rule. It didn't come again. But my skin crawled as I finished the patrol by stairwell, refusing to go anywhere near the elevator doors. Back in the office, I sat down and reread the rules for a third time. I don't know why I kept doing it. Maybe because I wanted them to make sense, to slot neatly into some rational explanation I could live with. But the more I read them, the more I was sure of one thing. These weren't written by a property manager worried about liability. They read like instructions for surviving something. The first hours on the job passed in a kind of slow suspension, the way time stretches when there's nothing to measure it against, except the ticking of a clock and the sound of your own footsteps. The resort was too big for one person to patrol comfortably. Each hallway felt longer than the last, with wallpaper curling in the corners and carpet that swallowed the sound of my boots until it felt like I was moving through a dream. By midnight, I'd already memorized the placement of the wall sconces, half of them dead, the other half flickering with a lazy pulse of yellow light. They didn't do much to cut the shadows, just carved out shallow islands of visibility, surrounded by dark that felt thicker than it should have been. The emptiness was the hardest part. It wasn't like being in a small, quiet place where the silence is peaceful. Here, the quiet had a density to it, like the air itself was pressing in on me. Every time I rounded a corner, I half expected something to be waiting. At 12:58 a.m., I checked the lobby clock before starting my next patrol. I'd been sticking to the rules as though they were law, not out of superstition. But because I'd already decided this place didn't need any extra variables. The stairwell was cold, the air dry and metallic. The overhead light hummed faintly, the kind of steady noise that makes you feel watched, even when you're alone. I'd made it halfway up to the second floor when it happened. Ding. It was faint, but sharp enough to cut through the quiet. I froze on the step. The sound came again, just a hair louder, a metallic chime followed by a faint shift of machinery. The elevator. My hand tightened on the stair rail. The rules were very clear. If you hear the elevator moving, take the stairs. I was already in them, but something about the sound made my skin prickle. Keane had said nothing on the upper floors was operational. He'd shown me the elevator on my tours, the brass gate closed, the panel dark. It shouldn't have been able to move. And yet, there it was, ding, followed by a distant, slow grinding of cables. I didn't want to be anywhere near those doors when they opened. The second floor landing was dimmer than I remembered from earlier patrols. The sconces here flickered, as though reacting to the elevator's movement, each one pulsing faintly before steadying again. The corridor was narrow, with long shadows stretching from each doorframe. My boots sank slightly into the carpet, releasing a stale, dusty smell with every step. The air here was colder than the lobby, cold enough that I could see my breath in short bursts. And then I saw it. Halfway down the hall, one door stood out. Its brass numbers caught the weak light. 612. The first thing that didn't make sense was the floor. This was only the second floor. Room 612 should have been 4 stories above me, behind locked doors I didn't have keys to. The second thing was the light. It wasn't bright, just a low amber glow spilling from the gap under the door. The shadows it cast on the carpet shifted subtly, like someone was moving around inside. I stopped several feet back, the hair on my arms lifting under my jacket. I didn't go closer. I didn't want to go closer. I remembered the rule. If you see lights in room 612, call the caretaker immediately. My radio sat on my belt, but when I reached for it, my fingers brushed cold plastic instead of the warm, familiar weight of active electronics. The thing was dead. No static, no click. I took a step backward, my boot making the faintest sound against the carpet, and the shadows under the door paused. Whatever was inside had heard me. I retreated down the hall, keeping my eyes on that sliver of light until I turned the corner and it vanished from view. My heart was pounding, each beat loud enough to drown out the distant hum of the building's heating system. Back in the stairwell, the air felt warmer, less constricted, but as I descended toward the lobby, I could still hear the faint echo of the elevator cables moving above me, as though something was riding them, slowly, down. When I reached the office, I closed the door behind me and locked it, something I hadn't bothered to do before. The rule sheet lay on the desk, and for the first time since arriving, I felt an irrational anger at it, like it was taunting me, daring me to question what I'd just seen. Patrol every floor once per hour. Do not look out the windows after midnight. If you hear the elevator moving, take the stairs. If you see lights in room 612, call the caretaker immediately. That last one burned into my vision. Room 612 didn't belong on the second floor. I'd seen the number. I sat there for the rest of the hour, pretending to review my notes, but really just listening. The elevator never dinged again. No more movement came from upstairs, but the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt expectant. The second night was quieter, too quiet. I'd already done 3 patrols, without so much as a creak of floorboards or a flicker of light where it shouldn't be. Even the elevator stayed silent, as though it had decided to behave now that I was expecting trouble. The boredom was worse than the fear. The silence pressed in on me like a thick blanket, making every minute feel longer than it was. My flashlight beam cut through empty corridors like a blade through fog. The same faded wallpaper, the same warped baseboards, the same locked doors with their tarnished brass handles. It was just past midnight when I wandered into one of the smaller lounges on the third floor. The room smelled faintly of mildew and stale cigarette smoke, a leftover from decades of guests before the place closed. A long bank of windows lined the far wall, framed by heavy curtains that sagged under their own weight. The glass was streaked with frost, catching the light from my flashlight in dull, jagged lines, and that's when I remembered the rule: do not look out the windows after midnight. I'd followed it without thinking the night before, because there'd been no reason to look outside. But now the temptation was there, the courtyard beyond those panes, hidden under fresh snow, waiting. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the stillness. Maybe it was that I wanted to prove to myself these rules were nothing but superstition. Or maybe, deep down, I wanted something to happen. I stepped closer. At first, all I saw was the courtyard, its stone fountain buried under a soft drift. The benches along the path half vanished in the snow. The wind had sculpted the surface into ripples that glinted faintly in the dim spill of light from the lounge. Then my eyes caught on something that didn't belong. A figure stood in the middle of the courtyard. It was facing the building. The snow came up to its knees, yet it didn't move, didn't shiver. It just stood there, head tilted slightly back, as though staring up at me. I froze. My breath fogged the glass in front of me, clouding the view. I stepped back, heart thudding, then leaned in again. It was still there. I told myself it had to be a statue, some leftover garden piece I hadn't noticed before, but the proportions were wrong. Too thin, too tall, the shoulders slightly hunched in a way that looked deliberate. The wind shifted, and a faint sound reached me, the brittle crunch of snow compacting under weight. I blinked, and when my eyes opened, the figure had moved. It was closer now, standing near the first bench, head still tilted up toward my window. I stumbled backward, my shoulder catching the edge of a side table. The lamp on it wobbled and nearly toppled. My pulse roared in my ears, and for a second I thought about running to the office, locking the door, and pretending none of this had happened. But when I looked back at the glass, the courtyard was empty, only smooth snow, no footprints. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my eyes were playing tricks in the low light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had seen me. The rest of my patrol felt wrong. The hallways seemed longer, the corners darker. Every time I passed a window, I kept my head turned away, afraid that if I looked, I'd see it again, closer, clearer. It was around 2:30 when I returned to the office. The small heater in the corner clicked as it cycled on, filling the space with a faint hum. I shut the door behind me and locked it, sliding into the chair with a shaky exhale. I'd just started logging my patrol notes when I heard it, soft at first, then more distinct. A slow, deliberate scrape of something heavy across the floor, just outside the door. Then another. The sound wasn't quite like normal footsteps. It had a drag to it, like someone moving with bare, wet feet, leaving streaks as they went. My throat tightened. I reached over and switched off the desk lamp. The office fell into darkness, broken only by the faint red glow from the clock radio. On the shelf, the scraping stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing. Then, so faint I almost missed it, a long, slow inhale from the other side of the door. I stayed frozen, every muscle tense, the wood grain of the desk edge digging into my palms. No knock, no jiggling of the handle, just that single, quiet breath, and then silence. I sat there in the dark for the rest of the night, afraid to move, my eyes fixed on the thin line of light under the door. No shadow passed by, but I knew something had been there, and it knew I'd looked by morning. I'd convinced myself that what happened in the courtyard had been nothing more than a trick of the eyes, snow shifting, shadows playing games, nerves getting the better of me. But the memory lingered, tucked behind my thoughts like a shard of glass I couldn't quite spit out. I told myself I needed a distraction. Supplies would do. The caretaker's pantry was stocked with some basics. But if I was going to be up there for weeks, I'd need more than stale crackers and cans with faded labels. So I drove down the winding road that cut through the pines and into the small town at the mountain's base. The place barely deserved the name town. A strip of weathered buildings lined one main road, a gas station with a flickering neon sign, a hardware store that doubled as a general shop, and a low brick bar with a sign that simply read, Henry's. The bar was as dim inside as the winter sky outside. A few locals nursed drinks at the counter, their jackets still dusted with snow. The air smelled of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the wood over decades. And something else, the sour tang of stale beer drying on the floor. I ordered coffee, thinking I'd warm up before hitting the shop. It started with a question I thought was harmless. You folks ever get much snow this early in the season? The bartender, a lean man with a salt and pepper beard, looked at me for a moment before answering. His eyes were pale, almost washed out, like they'd been staring into snow for too many winters. Depends where you're standing, he said, his voice low. Up at the old resort, you'll get storms you won't see down here at all. A man 2 stools down looked up from his drink. His expression was unreadable, but he kept his gaze on me longer than necessary. You staying up there? He asked. I hesitated, but there was no point in lying. Yeah, just for the winter. Security work. The man's jaw tightened. The bartender's eyes shifted away. A couple at the far table, who'd been quietly playing cards, stopped mid-hand. Wasn't the reaction I expected. No jokes about ghost stories, no friendly ribbing, just a kind of quiet that pressed in like the silence after you've said something you weren't supposed to. The man down the bar leaned toward me. His voice was so low I almost missed it under the hum of the beer cooler. Don't answer them when they knock. I blinked. Sorry, what? He stared at me for a moment longer, then went back to his drink without another word. The bartender came back with my coffee, setting it down with a clink. You'll want supplies before the weekend, he said, his voice just a shade too casual. Storm's coming. When I left the bar, the man who'd whispered to me was gone. The hardware store had the usual canned goods, bottled water, batteries. As I loaded up, a woman behind the counter, maybe in her 50s, kept glancing at me over the register. Finally, as she was ringing me up, she said, "You're working up at the Summit Lodge, aren't you?" I nodded, and her lips thinned into a line. My brother worked there, long time ago, before it closed. Why'd it shut down? I asked Art. Her eyes flicked to the door, as if making sure no one had come in. Disappearance problem, she said flatly. People went missing, guests, staff, always at night. Sometimes you'd find their shoes in the hall, sometimes a door hanging open to the snow, but never them. My hand paused halfway to the counter with a box of matches. They think they just wandered off. She shook her head. You don't wander far in a storm up there. You don't wander far at all unless something calls you out. On the drive back up the mountain, the road felt narrower. The pines leaned over like they were listening. I thought about the rules again. Patrol every floor once per hour. Do not look out the windows after midnight. If you hear the elevator moving, take the stairs. If you see lights in room 612, call the caretaker immediately at 3:17 a.m. Sit in the lobby and do not move until the grandfather clock chimes 3 times. Never speak to anyone you see inside after 2 a.m. They'd seemed like superstition at first. Now they felt more like defenses. By the time the resort came into view, its black windows staring down at me through the snow, I'd made up my mind. Whatever the rules were keeping out, it had already seen me, and if the locals were right, sooner or later, it would come knocking. The resort always seemed quieter after 2 in the morning. Not just quieter, emptier. The kind of stillness that makes you aware of how much sound usually exists in a space, even when you think you're alone. By then, the heating system's hum had settled into a slow, almost reluctant sigh. The wind outside rasped across the eaves like someone dragging their fingertips along wood grain, and the carpet beneath my boots no longer creaked. It just swallowed my steps whole, like the building didn't want to wake. It was during my 3rd patrol of the night that I first heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, low murmur threading its way through the walls. But as I slowed my steps, it began to take shape. Words, or at least the suggestion of them, muffled, layered, like several voices speaking over one another. Just out of reach, I froze in the hallway between the west stairwell and the old ballroom. My flashlight beam cut across peeling wallpaper, catching dust motes drifting in lazy spirals. The voices were coming from somewhere ahead, soft enough that I had to tilt my head to catch them. Rule 6 rose in my mind like a warning flare. Never speak to anyone you see inside after 2 a.m. But curiosity is a tricky thing. It doesn't always feel like breaking a rule. Sometimes it just feels like leaning in to hear better. The voices led me toward the north wing, the part of the resort that smelled older than the rest. There was a faint perfume in the air, the kind that reminded me of attics and antique dresses. Floral, powdery, clinging to the back of my throat. It shouldn't have been there. That hallway hadn't been touched in decades, according to the caretaker. I reached the corner and pressed my back against the wall, listening. The voices were clearer now, but still muffled, as though they were speaking from behind thick glass. When I stepped around the corner, the hallway stretched long and narrow ahead of me. My flashlight caught her instantly. She was standing about 20 feet away, near a faded door with a tarnished brass number. Her gown was pale, old-fashioned, floor-length with lace along the sleeves. Her hair was pinned up, the style belonging to another century. And her mouth was moving, but no sound came out. Her lips shaped words I couldn't hear. Her jaw moving smoothly, her eyes locked somewhere past me, unfocused. I should have turned and walked away. I should have remembered that the rules weren't suggestions, but there was something in the way she moved her mouth, slow, deliberate, pleading, that made the question slip out before I could stop myself. "Are you okay?" The effect was instant. Her head snapped toward me with a speed that made my neck ache in sympathy. Her eyes found mine, and her lips stretched into a smile that was too wide, too sharp at the corners. The movement pulled at the skin of her cheeks, until it looked ready to tear. I stumbled back a step, my flashlight trembling in my hand. She didn't move toward me. She just stood there, smiling, her chest unmoving. No breath, no blink. The perfume in the air grew stronger, cloying, making me want to gag. Then, without warning, the light bulb in the ceiling above me flickered and went out. When my beam passed back over the spot where she'd been, the hallway was empty. I finished the patrol without seeing her again, but every shadow felt thicker. Every door I passed seemed just barely ajar, like something had moved through ahead of me. By the time I locked myself in my room, I'd convinced myself it was over. Just one mistake, one crack in the wall of the rules, quickly sealed. But when I lay down, I realized the room wasn't as silent as it should have been. There was breathing. It was subtle at first, blending with my own. A slow inhale, a slower exhale. I held my breath, and it didn't stop. It wasn't coming from the hallway. It wasn't the wind under the eaves. It was in the room. I turned my head toward the darkest corner, the one farthest from the window, and that's when I smelled it again. Faint perfume, settling heavy in the air. The breathing grew louder, like whoever it belonged to was leaning closer. I didn't look. I didn't move. I just lay there, counting the seconds until the first trace of dawn began to gray the window. And the sound, finally, mercifully, faded. The lobby always felt too big. At night, even with the lights on, there were shadows in places I couldn't quite reach with my eyes. Corners where the glow from the lamps bent strangely, leaving pockets of dimness like they were hiding something on purpose. The air was cooler down here, too. The high, slanted beams overhead groaned every so often, a deep, slow sound like something shifting its weight. The rules were clear about this part. At 3:17 a.m., sit in the lobby and do not move until the grandfather clock chimes 3 times. It didn't explain why. None of the rules did. But by now I knew better than to test them. I arrived a few minutes early. The clock, tall, carved oak, with a face yellowed by decades, stood against the far wall like a sentry. Its pendulum swung back and forth in slow, deliberate arcs, ticking just loud enough to keep me company in the emptiness. I settled into one of the chairs facing the glass entrance doors. They were heavy double doors with brass handles, the kind you had to lean into an opening. Beyond them, only blackness. The small floodlights that should have lit the front walk were long dead. Their fixtures pointed uselessly into the dark. 3:16 a.m. The second hand crept along, each movement louder than it had any right to be. When the minute hand slid to 3:17 exactly, I felt it, that strange shift in the air I'd come to recognize. A stillness, but not the safe kind. The kind that meant the building was holding its breath. I didn't move, didn't even cross my legs. I just kept my eyes on the reflection of the clock's face in the glass. The first 30 seconds passed. Quietly, the wind outside rasped over the roof. Somewhere in the beams, something let out a low groan, like wood under too much weight. Then, from the darkness beyond the doors, there was movement. It wasn't quick. Whatever it was, moved slowly, deliberately, its bulk shifting against the faint glimmer of reflected light from inside. I couldn't make out details. No edges, no features, just a sense of mass. Something tall enough that its upper half was lost above the frame of the doors. I told myself not to blink, but I did. When my eyes opened again, it was closer. It didn't step into the light. It lingered at the threshold where the black met the glass, its outline murky, almost liquid, like the shadows themselves were rearranging to hold it together. Then the fog began to form. It started in small patches, near the center of the doors, blooming outward in slow, wet circles. My brain wanted to believe it was condensation from the difference between the warm lobby air and the cold night outside, but I could see it spreading in rhythm. Inhale, exhale. It was breathing on the glass. I gripped the armrests of the chair, my knuckles aching. The rules didn't say I couldn't look, just that I couldn't move, so I kept my gaze locked on the fog, watching it thicken until the outside world vanished completely. The clock behind me ticked on, but no chime came. 10 seconds, 15, 20. The pause stretched my pulse, keeping time in my ears. My mouth had gone dry, and I was suddenly aware of how small the lobby felt, how close the doors were to where I sat. The fog on the glass trembled, then smoothed, like whatever was outside had pressed its face closer. A faint shape appeared in the condensation, not quite human, not quite animal, a hint of a curve that could have been a cheek or an eye, and then it moved. The glass didn't rattle. It didn't bend or creak, but something slid along it, a slow vertical motion, as though a hand or something like a hand were dragging down the surface from the other side. I wanted the chimes. I wanted them now. Instead, the ticking seemed to grow louder, more insistent, but still no sound from the bell. The shape outside shifted again. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might echo off the glass. I could almost feel it noticing me now, the way its bulk leaned just slightly toward my chair. The fog blooming faster, the dark behind the door thickening until it felt like it was pushing against the barrier. Then, finally, the first chime rang out. The sound cut through the air like a blade, deep, resonant, the kind of tone you feel in your ribs before you hear it in your ears. The fog on the glass recoiled slightly, as if startled. The second chime followed, steady, unhurried. The shape began to shift backward, the darkness peeling away from the doorframe like it had been clinging to it. The third chime sounded, and just like that, the glass was clear. I sat there for another full minute after the last note faded, staring into the emptiness beyond the doors. The night outside looked exactly as it had when I first arrived, still, black, impenetrable. When I finally stood, my legs felt heavy, like I'd been sitting there for hours instead of minutes. I didn't bother looking for footprints. I knew there wouldn't be any. What worried me more was the way the glass still looked cleaner where the fog had been, as if whatever it was had wiped it before leaving. I woke to the sound of paper sliding across wood. It was faint, barely there, the kind of sound that normally wouldn't pull me out of sleep at all, but it cut clean through whatever dream I'd been tangled in. I opened my eyes. The room was still dim, washed in that early pre-dawn gray that made everything look flat and drained of color. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then I saw the envelope. It lay just inside the door, the edge of it still curling slightly from where it had been pushed underneath. The paper was cream-colored, the kind that felt heavier than it should. In your hand, I didn't get up right away. Something about it made me want to wait. When I finally crossed the room, I noticed the faintest smell rising from it, ink, fresh ink. It clung to the paper like it hadn't fully dried, though the writing inside would prove otherwise. I slid my thumb under the flap and opened it. Inside was a single sheet, identical in format to the one I'd been given when I started. The rules, except this time, they weren't the same. The first 5 rules were exactly as I remembered. The patrol schedule, the elevator warning, the room 612 lights, the 3:17 a.m. lobby ritual, and the silence after 2 a.m. But below those, in the same blocky type, were 2 new lines. Do not enter the ballroom after 4 a.m. If the phone rings twice in a row, unplug it immediately. That was it. No explanation, no greeting. I read the page 3 times in a row, my pulse tightening a little, more each time. At first I thought maybe this was a preemptive change, some new superstition from the caretaker. He had the kind of face that looked built for warnings, but something about the timing gnawed at me. The rules had never changed before. They'd been the same since the first night. I'd gotten used to their shape, their rhythm, even the strangeness of them. Now they'd grown teeth I hadn't seen before. And the caretaker, he didn't call when I first arrived. He didn't check in when I'd seen things. He only called when something had shifted, which meant these changes weren't arbitrary. They were a response. The phone rang just after 8. I jumped at the sound, the corded desk phone rattling against the wall. It was a single long ring, the normal kind. Still, my hand hovered over it longer than necessary before I picked it up. "Morning," the caretaker said. His voice was gravelly, like someone who'd been up all night. "You got the update?" "Yes." My voice came out, flatter than I meant it to. "What changed?" "Just read it," he said. "Follow it exactly. Things are moving faster than I'd like." "What do you mean faster?" A pause. I could almost hear him thinking. "They learn," he said finally. "If they can't get to you one way, they'll find another. That's all you need to know." The line clicked dead before I could ask more. I sat there with the receiver still in my hand, listening to the empty hum. My eyes drifted back to the new rules. The ballroom. I'd only been in it once, during my first week. A massive echoing chamber with a polished floor and chandeliers that hung too low, their crystals yellowed with dust. Even then, it had felt wrong. The air had been heavier than in the rest of the building, and the acoustics had made every step sound like it belonged to someone else. Now, I couldn't go in there after 4 a.m., which meant something was in there. After 4 a.m., the second edition, the phone made less sense at first. Why 2 rings? Why not 1? Why not 3? It was the specificity that made my stomach knot. The rules had always been precise, and precision meant they'd been learned the hard way. Someone, at some point, had let the phone ring twice. I didn't want to know what had happened next. The rest of the day passed with that envelope sitting on my desk, the paper inside whispering at the edge of my thoughts. I tried to keep busy checking supply rooms, walking the halls, avoiding the temptation to peek into the ballroom just to see if anything had changed. Every time I passed the grand double doors to that room, though I felt something behind them, not a sound, not a movement, just awareness. Like the space beyond the wood was holding still, listening for me to slip. I didn't linger. By nightfall, the paranoia had settled into my bones. I kept the phone cord draped loosely so I could pull it free quickly if needed. I kept glancing at the clock, counting down toward 4 a.m., telling myself I'd be nowhere near the ballroom when it came. Still, as I made my patrols, I couldn't shake the sense that the building was narrowing around me. Every hallway felt slightly longer. Every turn seemed to end closer to a shadow than before. The rules weren't just for my safety anymore. There were boundaries in a game, and the other side had started making their move. By the time I returned to my room near dawn, the envelope had been moved. It was subtle, just shifted a few inches across the desk. But I knew I hadn't touched it since morning. The window was still locked. The door still bolted. Something had been in here, and it wanted me to know. It could get close without breaking any rules at all. The clock in the hallway had already passed 4. I'd been careful that night, keeping my patrol routes short and avoiding the ballroom doors entirely. The new rule, do not enter the ballroom after 4 a.m., had been rattling around in my head like a loose coin in a dryer since the moment I'd read it. I'd told myself I wouldn't go near that end of the building, that I'd stay on the opposite side, maybe even stay in my room until morning. But the thing about telling yourself don't think about it is that you start thinking about nothing else. At 4:05 the music started. It was faint at first, more a suggestion than a sound, the kind of thing you could mistake for a distant radio or someone humming through the walls. But as I stood in the hallway, the notes began to sharpen. Slow, deliberate, 3-count rhythm, a waltz. The melody had a warped quality, like it was being played on a turntable, running just a fraction too slow. There was something fragile about it, as though the sound itself might crumble if I breathed too loud. It was coming from the ballroom. I told myself to walk away. I even took 2 steps in the opposite direction before stopping. The thing was, I needed to know, not out of bravery, not out of curiosity, even it was more primal than that. It was the same pull that makes you look at the shape in the dark corner of your room, instead of closing your eyes and pretending it isn't there. I reached the ballroom doors in less than a minute. The air changed as I approached, colder, sharper, carrying with it a faint scent of candle wax and something else, something metallic that lingered at the back of my throat. The heavy double doors were cracked just enough for a sliver of light to spill out, pale and flickering, like candle flames moving behind frosted glass. The music was louder here, and I realized it wasn't coming from a speaker. This was live, or at least, it had the texture of something played by real instruments. I put my hand on the door. The wood was cool under my palm, and I looked inside. The cracked marble floor stretched out under a scatter of warm light. The chandeliers above were burning, but not with electricity. Each crystal arm was tipped with candles, their wax running in frozen drips that never seemed to fall. Couples moved across the floor in slow, perfect circles. Their clothing was a century out of date, long gowns, high collars, tails, and gloves. The silk shimmered faintly as they turned, the colors muted but rich, like something preserved in a faded painting. Their faces were wrong, not grotesque, not at first glance, but indistinct, features blurred as though I were looking at them through warped glass. Eyes, noses, mouths were all there, but softened, slipping just out of focus whenever I tried to pin them down. I stood there too long. The couples moved with a precision that felt mechanical, each turn timed to the waltz's rhythm. But then, one dancer broke the pattern. A man in a black suit, taller than the rest, his steps deliberate but unhurried. He turned his partner, and for the first time, his face came into focus. It was the figure from the courtyard, the same deep eyes, the same expressionless mouth. Even from across the room, those eyes locked on mine, as though they'd been waiting for me to arrive. The music faltered, just for a beat, then stopped entirely. Silence in the ballroom was worse than the music had been. Every single head turned toward me. No sound, no shuffling of feet, just that synchronized, glacial shift of attention. The blur in their faces was gone now. They were sharp, clear, wrong. I stepped back, my shoulder hitting the doorframe. The man from the courtyard began to walk toward me, and though he moved slowly, the space between us seemed to vanish too quickly, as if the floor itself had shortened. I slammed the door and ran. The hallway outside felt narrower than usual, the air denser, like I was wading through something invisible. My shoes thudded against the carpet runner, heartbeat matching the rhythm of my steps. Then came the sound from above, a metallic groan, followed by a quick skittering scrape. Something was moving in the vents. I didn't look up, not at first, but the noise was following me, pacing my run from the ceiling. The ducts rattled as whatever it was shifted from one section to the next. It moved fast, faster than I could manage, even at a sprint. A vent cover ahead of me shuddered, just slightly, as though something inside had pressed its weight against it for a fraction of a second. Then it went still. I kept moving. By the time I reached the stairwell, I risked a glance upward. In the corner where two duct lines met, something pale was pressed against the grate. It might have been a hand. Long, narrow fingers curled loosely through the slits. The skin, if that's what it was, looked damp, like it had been soaking in water. As I stared, the fingers flexed. I bolted down the stairs, not caring how loud I was. In my room, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and sat in the dark, breathing hard. The music hadn't started again, but in the silence, I could hear faint scratching above the ceiling tiles. Slow, patient, like something settling in for a long wait. That was the first time I truly understood what the caretaker had meant. When he said they learn, I hadn't just seen them. I'd let them see me. And now they knew how to get closer without ever opening a door. It was almost 2 in the morning when I saw the light. I'd been making my usual rounds, trying to keep my head clear after what happened in the ballroom. For the past few nights, I'd avoided the vents, avoided the east hallway entirely, telling myself I was simply being cautious, not scared. But the truth was that the thing in the ducts had made me flinch at every faint rattle above my head. That night, the hotel was unnervingly still, the kind of stillness that makes you think you're the only living thing inside its walls. I had just passed the intersection that led toward the west wing when I caught a faint glow at the far end of the hall. Room 612. The rule came back instantly, as sharp as if I'd just read it. If you see lights in room 612, call the caretaker immediately. Stood there, staring down the length of the carpeted hallway. The glow was a muted amber, the kind of light you get from an old desk lamp, warm, almost inviting. But the longer I looked at it, the less right it seemed. It didn't flicker the way real light should. It was constant, steady, like it was painted onto the air. I took out my phone and dialed the caretaker's number. It rang, once, twice, a third time. No answer. That had never happened before. I hung up and tried again, my other hand tightening on the flashlight clipped to my belt. Still nothing. No voicemail, No click of the line picking up, just an endless ring that felt colder with each repetition. The light at the end of the hall didn't change. My first instinct was to leave, go back to the lobby, lock myself in until morning. But the problem with being alone in this place was knowing that if I didn't check, no one else would. I started walking. The air cooled as I approached, a thin, sharp chill that bit at my skin like the first breath of winter. My footsteps softened, the sound dampened by the carpet, as if the hallway itself was absorbing the noise. When I reached the door to 612, I noticed it wasn't latched. The brass handle hung just a fraction of an inch out of place, and the door itself was open by the slimmest crack, just enough for the light to spill out in that unnatural amber sheet. I pushed. The hinges didn't creak. The door opened slow, as though resisting me, like I was pushing against water. Inside, it wasn't a hotel room. It was my office, not just similar, identical. The same scratched desk, the same chair with its uneven back leg, the same filing cabinet with the dent in the bottom drawer where I'd kicked it one frustrated night. Only, it wasn't alive. Everything was still. Dust hung suspended in the air like it had been caught mid-full. Papers on the desk didn't stir. Even when I stepped inside, my breath came out in a cloud, and only then did I realize how cold it was. Snow was drifting down from somewhere above, tiny, perfect flakes, slow enough that I could watch each one spiral through the air before it landed silently on the desk or the floor. I turned in place, scanning the corners. The light was coming from my desk lamp, the one I kept on low when working late, but the bulb was coated in frost, and yet it still burned steady, casting everything in that amber glow. I was about to step closer when I saw the chair. It was occupied. It took me a full 2 seconds to understand what I was looking at, because my mind refused to process it. It was me. I was sitting there, or something, wearing my exact skin was. Same uniform, same hair, even the faint scar on my left hand from when I'd sliced it on a broken door hinge years ago. But it wasn't breathing. Its eyes were open, fixed on the doorway where I stood. Frost rimmed the eyelashes. A thin layer of ice crusted over its shirt, crackling faintly when it moved, except it hadn't moved. Not yet. I should have left right then. I should have slammed the door and run. Rules be damned. But something about the stillness pulled at me. The cold wasn't just physical, it had a weight to it, pressing against my skull, slowing my thoughts until they felt syrup thick. I took one step closer. The snow crunched under my boot. The first sound I'd heard in the room besides my own breathing. The thing in the chair blinkered. It was slow, deliberate, a long drag of eyelids closing and opening. And then it smiled, not wide, just the faintest curl of the lips, enough to make me take a step back without realizing it. My hand went to my flashlight, but when I clicked it on, the beam barely cut through the amber light, like it was being swallowed before it could reach the walls. The air was sharper now, biting at the inside of my nose, burning my throat when I breathed. My duplicate didn't move again, but the snow was falling faster, the flakes bigger, heavier. Some of them melted into water when they hit the carpet. Others hissed faintly, leaving behind tiny scorch marks. I don't remember deciding to leave. One moment I was staring into my own eyes, and the next I was in the hallway, pulling the door shut hard enough that the frame shuddered. The light vanished, instantly, like it had never been there. But the cold didn't. It clung to me all the way back to the lobby. A phantom chill burrowed into my bones. Even after I sat in the warmest corner of the security office, wrapped in my jacket, I couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere, in a room that shouldn't exist, I was still sitting in that chair, still watching myself walk away. I had once thought the rules were finite. A-list, 7 items, easy to memorize, easy to follow. But over the past week, they began changing. First it was subtle, the caretaker leaving scribbled notes on my desk, written in his cramped block letters. Avoid the third-floor hallway after 4:20 a.m. Then another. Don't answer the lobby phone until the second ring. By the third day, there were new ones waiting for me every time I returned from patrol. Some were oddly specific. If the vending machine in the staff break room is humming, unplug it immediately, while others were impossibly vague. Don't look down when you hear the name Thomas. I started keeping them in a neat stack, reading them over and over like they might rearrange themselves into something sensible. They didn't. The routine I'd clung to since my first night began to crumble. Patrols that had once been methodical turned into jagged, nervous loops as I avoided more and more locations, Entire wings of the resort became forbidden zones overnight. The entities weren't helping. Before, they had been predictable. In a way, they stayed in their places. The ballroom dancers didn't leave the ballroom. The thing in the vents stayed above me. Room 612's doppelganger only appeared when its light was on. Now I'd round a corner and find one of them standing in a place it had no business being. I saw one of the dancers from the ballroom, face still blurred, body impossibly fluid, standing outside the elevator doors on the 5th floor, just waiting. It didn't turn to face me, but its head tilted as I passed, following my footsteps until I was out of sight. The air in the hotel felt different. To Dot, it wasn't just cold anymore, it had weight. Every breath was heavy, like I was inhaling someone else's exhale. There was a faint metallic temps in it, almost coppery, like the air after a lightning strike, or the taste of blood on your tongue. At night, the whispering started. It came from everywhere, behind walls, under the floorboards, from the vents above my bed. I could never make out the words, but it was constant, like hundreds of voices, just out of range. If I stood still for too long, it would swell, crowding into my ears until I could feel my pulse in my teeth. Then came the night the clocks stopped. It was 3:17 a.m., the cursed time from the original list of rules, the one that said to sit in the lobby and not move until the grandfather clock chimed 3 times. I'd done it without fail every single night, clinging to the ritual because it was clear and simple and safe. I was in the lobby when the minute hand clicked into place. The second hand moved, and then froze. I thought it was just the grandfather clock at first, but when I checked my watch, its hands were stuck too. The wall clock behind the reception desk, the same. Even the digital display on my phone had gone blank. The silence that followed wasn't real silence. It was thicker, deeper, like the sound had been scooped out of the air and replaced with something else. The whispering rose instantly, all around me, louder now, more deliberate. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was directed at me. The walls seemed to breathe. It was subtle at first, the faintest expansion and contraction of the wallpaper, like there was something on the other side pushing against it. But soon, I could hear it too. A low, slow inhalation. Then, an exhalation that carried a dry, rasping undertone. That's when I heard the first door open. It was a slow creak, like someone easing it open just enough to peek through. Then another, and another. The sound was coming from everywhere at once, from upstairs, from down the hall, from the service corridor behind me. Every locked door in the building was opening. I couldn't see them yet, but I could feel them. Something about that frozen time had stripped away the thin boundaries that had been holding this place together. Whatever had been lurking behind those doors was free now, and they were taking their time stepping out. I stayed in the lobby, just like the original rule had said, but I didn't think it mattered anymore. The air shifted, a cold draft curling around my legs. From the far hallway, I saw the shadow of something long and thin stretch across the carpet, too long to belong to a person. The grandfather clock didn't chime. The minute hand didn't twitch. Time wasn't moving, and I was trapped inside. An hour that wouldn't end. The first set of footsteps came from behind me, slow, deliberate, uneven, as if whatever it was had one leg shorter than the other. I didn't turn. I just stared at the unmoving face of the grandfather clock, willing it to come back to life. Then, from upstairs, came the sound of something crawling fast, nails dragging against wood, and from the front doors, the faint fogging of the glass like someone was standing outside, breathing slowly against it. The whispering began to overlap, voices speaking over each other in a frenzy, too fast for me to process. The walls pulsed harder now, the wallpaper stretching like fabric. Something pressed against the glass of the lobby door from the inside, a hand, thin and pale, leaving a streak of frost behind. I backed toward the center of the room. My breath was loud in my own ears, the only sound I could control. Everything else was converging, footsteps, scraping, whispering, breathing, all of it closing in. And then, from somewhere deep in the building, something massive moved. Not footsteps, a shift, like the entire foundation of the resort was settling. The ceiling light above me swayed once. Every open door creaked wider. I didn't know if I should run or stay perfectly still. My instincts were split down the middle, and every second I hesitated felt like an invitation for whatever was out there to make the choice for me. The air was so thick with that metallic temps now that I could taste it on my tongue. The breathing, walls were closer. I don't know how long I stood there before it happened, before the first shape emerged from the hallway, but it wasn't a shape, it was a shadow without a body, peeling itself off the wall like wet paper, rising into a form that almost looked human. It didn't walk toward me, it slid, and when it reached the edge of the lobby carpet, it stopped, head tilting as if it were listening to something I couldn't hear. The whispering cut off. The silence that followed was worse, because in that silence, I realized I could hear something else, a faint, rhythmic sound. Tick, tick, tick. The second hand on the grandfather clock had started again, but it was moving backward. The call came just after sunset. I almost didn't answer lately. The phone had been more of a threat than a lifeline, but the display showed the caretaker's number. I picked up on the second ring. Like the rules demanded. "You have one last shift," he said. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, a rasp wrapped in static. "Follow the rules exactly, and you'll survive." There was a pause, like he wanted to say more but couldn't. Then the line went dead. I stared at the silent phone for a long time, before putting it back on the desk. The air in the lobby already felt wrong before my shift even began. Too still, too heavy. My own movements sounded muffled, as if the walls were lined with something soft that absorbed the noise. The rules, the original list, the caretaker's newer notes, and the dozens of last-minute scraps I'd collected, sat in a neat stack on the desk. I read them one by one, committing each to memory, whispering them under my breath until the syllables blurred together. I didn't know why this was my last shift, but the way he said it left no room for misunderstanding. This wasn't a promotion, this was survival. The night moved slowly, every minute stretching taut. I did my rounds exactly as instructed. Never took the east stairwell between 2:14 and 2:28. Avoided eye contact with anyone in the hall after midnight. Ignored the lobby phone the first time it rang, answered it the second. Hung up without speaking. At 3 o'clock. I returned to the lobby to wait for the 3:17 chime, just like I always had. This time, my stomach felt heavier. I could hear things moving, far away, faint footsteps above, the creak of a distant door, the low hum of the vending machine upstairs, but nothing ventured close. When the grandfather clock's minute hand reached 3:17, the air in the room shifted. It always did, but this time, it was different. A sharper drop in temperature, a denser stillness. The clock began its slow, deliberate chime. 1, 2, 3, and then, every light in the building went out. Not just the lobby, the whole resort. The only sound was the fading echo of the last chime, swallowed by the darkness until there was nothing. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face, the kind of dark that erases depth, where you can't tell if the walls are inches or miles away. I froze, heart pounding, ears straining for any sign of movement. That's when I heard it. It didn't sound like footsteps. Not exactly. It was heavier, slower, the kind of sound you feel as much as hear, the air shifting with each movement. A deep pressure rolling toward me in waves. Something massive was inside the lobby. I couldn't tell where it was. Not exactly. Sometimes the displacement of air felt like it was right in front of me. Other times off to the side, circling. My breath sounded too loud, like it might give me away. The rules didn't say what to do if the lights failed. I didn't know if I was allowed to move. I didn't know if I was allowed to breathe. The thing shifted again, and I caught the faintest scrape, not of claws, but something dragging lightly across the floor, as if testing the texture of the carpet. The air around me grew colder. Not the kind of cold you shiver through, the kind that seeps deep into your bones, that makes your teeth ache. I could hear my own pulse in my ears, fast and uneven. Something exhaled. It wasn't a human breath. It was slower, thicker, like it was pulling the air out of the room and tasting it before letting it go. I felt it roll across my skin, and every hair on my arm stood on end. There was a sudden thud, not close, maybe halfway across the room, but heavy enough to make the floor tremble under my feet. Then another, slightly nearer. Each one came with that same invisible push of air, pressing against me, before pulling back. It was moving toward me, one step at a time. I remembered one of the older rules. If you hear something large in the lobby, stay exactly where you are until it passes. The problem was, the rule never said what to do if it didn't pass. I stayed rooted to the spot, muscles screaming to move. My eyes strained uselessly against the dark, as if I could will shapes to appear. The thing stopped. It was close now, too close. The cold, was so intense I felt it in my teeth, a deep, aching freeze. And then came the faintest sound, something brushing my sleeve. Not a full touch, more like a deliberate near-miss, just enough to let me know it was aware of me. My chest locked up. I couldn't tell if it was leaning over me or circling again. The air pressure shifted in slow arcs, and each time I caught a whisper of movement, fabric shifting, the scrape of something over carpet, and then, without warning, it moved. One massive thud, so close I felt the vibration run through the soles of my shoes, followed by a long, deliberate scrape. It was behind me now. I didn't breathe. Seconds stretched into minutes, or maybe it was less. Time meant nothing in that blackness. Finally, the air pressure lessened. The cold thinned. Whatever it was moving away. But I didn't dare believe it until the sound faded completely, and then the lights came back on. The lobby was empty. The clock read 3:18 a.m. I exhaled slowly, but the relief never came, because I realized something in that moment. The caretaker had told me to follow the rules exactly. I had, but the thing in the lobby had never followed any rules at all. It wasn't bravery, it wasn't even defiance, it was the simple truth that the rules had never been for my safety. They were a leash, and tonight I decided I'd rather face whatever waited beyond them than keep circling the same post until something finally dragged me under. The first one I broke was the easiest. Do not look out the windows after midnight. I went to the lobby's tall front panes, my breath fogging the glass, and pressed my forehead to the cold surface. Outside, there was no snow anymore, no parking lot, no mountains, just an endless black plain stretching in all directions, rippling faintly like the surface of deep water. Things moved under it, long shapes, slow and deliberate, the tips of their ridges barely breaking the surface before sinking again. One of them turned. I didn't see a face, just a subtle shift. A ripple aimed toward me, a pressure began behind my eyes, as if invisible fingers were pressing inward. My breath quickened. Something was coming closer. I tore myself from the glass and stumbled back, but my legs carried me into the next broken rule. Never speak to anyone you see inside after. To a She was standing in the hall by the elevator, pale, hair damp, wearing a guest's robe. Her eyes were glassy, but they locked onto mine with unnatural precision. You shouldn't be here, I said before I could stop myself. Her mouth twitched, then stretched far wider than it should have. From that opening came not words, but a low, rushing hiss, like wind through a canyon. My ears popped. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely in the hallway. When they came back, she was gone. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I backed away and made the third mistake. Do not enter the ballroom. I pushed through the heavy double doors and was hit with air colder than outside in January. The chandelier swayed as if something had passed beneath them. On the far end of the room, the floor bulged upward in the center, stretching the carpet into a slow-moving ripple. I couldn't look away. The bulge moved toward me, the wood underneath groaning. A sharp crack split the silence as a floorboard snapped, and something pale, jointed, and impossibly long slid up through the gap. Not an arm, not a leg, more like the pale roots of some massive tree, writhing in slow waves. I stumbled backward into the hall, slammed the doors, and heard the wood continue to splinter on the other side. I didn't even realize the lobby phone was ringing until it was already too late. Only answer the phone on the second ring, then hang up without speaking. I snatched the receiver on the first ring and shouted into it. What do you want from me? For a second, there was only static. Then, layered voices, dozens of them, began speaking at once. None in unison, none intelligible, but all wrong in the same way. Too close, as if they were standing inside my own skull. The static rose, a hiss that became a roar, until it was no longer sound but pressure, vibrating my teeth and jaw. When the line went dead, I realized my nose was bleeding. The threats didn't take turns, they came all at once. From the ballroom doors came the slow splinter of wood and the scrape of something massive dragging itself forward. The hallway lights flickered, and that woman, the one from the elevator, appeared again, mouth still, impossibly wide, the hiss from before, now deafening. From the windows, the black plane rippled harder, the ridged shapes underneath now fully breaking the surface. The air temperature dropped in an instant, so fast my breath crystallized mid-air. My ears filled with overlapping noises, the hiss, the dragging, the crack of splintering boards. and somewhere beneath it all, a wet, rhythmic sound like a slow heartbeat. The pressure from outside built until the windows bowed inward. My vision, tunneled. The woman in the hall moved closer without walking, her face jerking forward in unnatural snaps. From the ballroom, the pale, root-like limb slammed against the door, warping the wood outward. The phone began to ring again. This time, every ring sounded like it was right beside me. No matter where I moved, I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did nothing. The noises came from inside now. The rules hadn't been a game of survival. They'd been a lock, and I'd just thrown every bolt. The ballroom doors gave way with a sickening crack, splinters raining across the lobby. The pale limbs surged forward, searching, curling around the edges of furniture. The woman's face was inches from mine now, the hiss becoming a shriek, her eyes black and reflecting the rippling shapes from outside. And then, behind it all, impossibly close, came the sound of glass fracturing. The lobby windows shattered inward. The black plane outside wasn't outside anymore. It poured in, a thick, liquid dark, moving with the weight of an ocean and the intent of a predator. The shapes beneath it rose up, ridged and endless, their size impossible to comprehend. The air itself seemed to collapse, every sound merging into a single deafening roar. Something cold and massive closed around my ankle, and then, nothing. The moment the glass gave way, the roar stopped, not because it quieted, but because something larger swallowed it. Silence. A silence so complete, it made my own breath sound foreign. The black water, or whatever it was, halted mid-pour, shivering in place like it was listening. The pale limbs from the ballroom froze too, coiled mid-rich. Even the woman in the hallway went still, her jaw hanging open in an unnatural stretch. And then, they turned, not toward me, but toward the lobby doors. The wind hit first, a sharp, biting gust that cut through the heat of my skin like it wanted to carve the shape of my bones. The double doors at the far end of the lobby swung open on their own, hinges screaming. Beyond them, the storm howled, but not the same storm I'd seen on my arrival nights ago. Snow fell in heavy, deliberate flakes, each one seeming to hang in the air just long enough for me to notice its shape before melting into nothing. The courtyard lay beyond, blanketed white, except for the figures, dozens of them. They were scattered across the snow, some standing, some slumped against benches, some half buried, as if the drifts had grown around them over years. Even from the threshold, I could tell they were human, or had been. The black plane behind me rippled again, pushing forward, urging me toward the open doors. The ballroom limbs slid back through their broken boards, like snakes retreating underground. The woman's hiss faded into a wet gasp. That was as if they'd been given permission to leave, or perhaps an order to stop. And that's when I understood. The rules hadn't been written to keep me alive. They'd been written to keep it here. Every patrol, every restriction, every forbidden glance or movement, they weren't superstitions. They were locks. Ritual locks, and I had broken all of them. I stepped into the cold. The snow crunched under my boots, a sound that seemed too loud for the open air. The figures in the courtyard didn't move at first. They just stood, heads bowed, their shapes blurred under layers of frost and ice. The wind picked up, carrying something faint on it, a strain of music, distant, elegant, a waltz, though slowed, warped, as if played underwater. It was coming from the ballroom. The ballroom I had opened. The nearest figure twitched. Its head lifted slightly, and ice cracked down its neck like breaking glass. I took another step, my breath misting out in front of me. One by one, they began to stir, fingers flexing with the brittle snap of frozen twigs, heads turning with the sound of grinding frost. None of them looked at me. Instead, they all turned toward the lobby, toward the black water still trembling inside. The storm swirled harder, the air so cold it felt sharp in my lungs. My legs screamed to move, to run, but each step felt heavier, the snow gripping my boots as though it wanted to keep me here. One figure broke from the others, a tall man in what looked like an old-fashioned bellhop uniform, the brass buttons glinting faintly under the snowlight. His face was obscured by a thick mask of frost, but I could feel his eyes on me. He took a step forward, then another dot, and with each movement, the others began to follow. Not in jerky, stiff motions like statues waking, but with the smooth precision of people who had been waiting for this exact moment. The wind shifted again, and I caught sight of the open lobby doors behind me. The black water was gone. The limbs, the woman, all of it, in their place. The lobby looked empty, silent. I could step back inside, close the doors, pretend, or I could keep running into the storm, away from this place, away from whatever I had just unleashed. I ran. Snow sprayed up around me, biting into my face, coating my lashes until the world blurred white. The music from the ballroom grew fainter behind me, replaced by the crunch of dozens of synchronized footsteps in the snow. They weren't chasing. Not yet. It felt worse than if they had been. The cold grew heavier, thicker, until it felt alive. Each breath was a fight. My legs burned, my fingers went numb inside my gloves, and my ears rang with the wind's relentless wail. But beneath it, softer now, was another sound, a low, measured beat, like a drum, like a heart. It was coming from all around me, somewhere in the storm, far ahead. I thought I saw lights, warm, golden, swaying in the wind, a shape like a building, or maybe another resort. I pushed harder toward it, ignoring the ache in my chest, the bloodless stiffness in my hands. But with each step, the lights seemed to shift farther away. Behind me, the footsteps in the snow stopped. The wind died. The silence returned. And from somewhere close, far too close, came the sound of a door creaking open. I don't know if I escaped that night. I don't know if anyone ever does. All I know is that the snow never covered my tracks. They were still there, stretching out behind me into the white, waiting for something to follow.